Let's see if the recording is going. Okay, so I guess it's time to get started. So we're very, very happy to have Professor Paulina Sliwa here at our seminar of let's say the practice project, the RTI Center, and the Mind and Ethics group at the University of Rome 3. Professor Paulina Sliwa is based at the University of Vienna, and she works in ethics and moral epistemology. She's one of the world leading figures in the moral epistemology debate. She's the author of like a long list of great articles and contributions. She's now working, as far as I know, on a book project in moral epistemology titled Telling Right from Wrong, Moral Testimony and Moral Knowledge, and maybe she will tell us whether the paper she presents today is part of that project. And at the same time, she's working on a project on the ethics of responsibility, I suppose, like a project on blame and excuses. She's interested in moral psychology as well, in feminist philosophy, and I suppose I'm missing something, so I'll close it here. Today, she's going to give us a talk about changing hearts and minds. And I'd say, without any further ado, I'll leave you the floor. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Okay, so this is a paper I've been working on for an embarrassingly long time. It is supposed to be part of the book project, but it has taken me into slightly surprising directions, which I didn't quite anticipate when I started out on it. Okay, so the book project as a whole is intended as a defense of moral testimony as a source of moral knowledge and as a source of moral understanding. And the paper that I want to present today kind of picks up one particular objection to moral testimony and tries to respond to it. And in the course of that, it ends up kind of rethinking what moral testimony and moral advice can be and what it can look like and what it can achieve. And the immediate problem that I'm interested in is the idea that moral understanding may well give you moral knowledge about your situation, but it is unable to change your feelings about the situation. So it can change minds, but it cannot change hearts. It can transmit knowledge, but because it cannot change our affective responses, it is unable to kind of give you a deeper sense of moral understanding. And that idea that this is a serious problem for moral testimony, that's found pretty pervasively in the moral testimony literature. Even so, and it's in a weird kind of coincidence, it's where friends and foes of moral testimony agree. Foes think this is a serious problem, like friends of moral testimony think that's just like a limitation that we have to accept. But the idea is that kind of moral testimony cannot change your feelings. And so if you form a moral judgment that's on moral testimony alone, you may come to be emotionally alienated or emotionally detached from the judgment that you accept. You may come to know that a given course of action is right or wrong, but you won't really feel it. The kind of the foes of moral testimony think that such a disconnect is inherently problematic. So it should lead us to just question whether we should ever be relying on moral testimony at all. And you can find that in the literature. I've given two kind of exemplary quotes on the handout. One is by Howell, who says that it is perhaps more important that deference can be problematic because of the state it leaves the agent in after deference. For one thing, when one receives moral knowledge by testimony, it is very unlikely that one is receiving the disposition to react emotionally as well. And we find that also in Fletcher's paper, who argues that it seems so moral testimony seems problematic either because one probably cannot form moral judgments through deference. That is if you're actually a moral sentimentalist, as Fletcher is, or because even if one can do so, forming moral judgments in that way is likely to lead to a clash or discord between one's moral judgments and one's moral sentiments. Okay, so that's kind of another objection to moral testimony. Okay, and so in both ideas, it's, moral testimony might give you knowledge, but even if it can do so, it will leave you emotionally alienated. Okay, so I think that there are good reasons to be a little bit skeptical about the conclusion that these people want to draw. And so the idea is that, I think what we should question is the thought that if moral testimony cannot change your feelings, it will result, like moral testimony is going to be problematic. I think this is very unlikely to be true. I think it is unlikely to be true because it is simply false that an agent who, like in general, relies on moral testimony will end up being emotionally alienated from their judgment. The thing is that often, I think what underlies this idea is the thought that, agents who, sorry, I'm going to have to, I thought I could leave the door open, but I cannot. There's just noise. I will have to. I'm so sorry. Okay, so let me find my way back. Okay, sorry. So why would you think that moral testimony was going to leave you morally detached? It's because you think that the agent who seeks out moral advice, moral guidance in the first place, is someone who is not appropriately emotionally attuned to the situation. So the kind of presupposition here is that the reason why we have to look for moral advice or moral testimony in the first place is because we are insufficiently kind of attuned emotionally to the features of our moral situation. That's what explains why we are uncertain or ignorant about what the right answer is. And then moral testimony cannot change your feelings, so it adjusts your beliefs, but your feelings remain detached, and that's why you're in this alienated state. But I think what we need to question is this idea that the reason why we're uncertain or why we're morally ignorant about our situation is because we lack effective attunement. I think this is in the situations in which we look for moral guidance to other people, that is actually very often false. And we can see that if we think about the fact that we often look for moral guidance in situations that are complicated, where there are kind of multiple considerations which pull us in different directions, right? So like, suppose I need to decide whether to put my mother, like maybe my elderly mother, whether to move her out of her home into a nursing home. Like in that case, there's going to be considerations of her autonomy, which are pulling me in one direction. There's considerations about kind of her safety, which pull me in another. And I may be perfectly emotionally attuned to the situation. Like I feel the force of both of those. That's why I'm conflicted. Like that's why I don't know which way to decide. And this is why I look to moral testimony for help, kind of to how to resolve the situation. Moreover, in those situations, it is simply false to think that there is a right way to feel that moral testimony should be able to adduce. The right way to feel in situations which involve like multiple complicated features which draw me in opposite directions is to feel conflicted. It's to feel ambivalent about the situation. It's to feel it like the force of all of them. And so kind of moral testimony in those situations leaves you it's not that it leaves you no better, or like that it can't help. It's like, there's nothing you need help with emotionally. What you need help with is like coming to the right judgment about what to do in this situation. Okay, so I think we should question the idea that, moral testimony that because it cannot change feelings, it is going to leave agents in this alienated state. So I think that's kind of independently, we should be suspicious. But moreover, I think we should be suspicious of the claim that moral testimony cannot change your feelings, that it cannot make you more emotionally attuned to the situation. And that's the kind of line of argument that I want to explore in the rest of the paper. Okay. So I want to suggest that it's true that there are certain kinds of testimony which do not seem to do much to our emotional situation or to our kind of emotional attunement with a situation. And moreover, those tend to be the kinds of testimony in which the literature and the examples in the literature have focused. So if you are familiar with the literature of moral testimony, the kind of prime paradigm example is Alison Hill's case of Eleanor, who's like unsure whether or not she should eat meat. She's like started to hear that there's some issues about it, but rather than thinking about it herself, she just asks her friend Mary, who's a reliable moral agent, whether it is permissible or not to eat meat. And Mary tells her it's not permissible. Okay, so in that case, I mean, clearly Eleanor is going to come to a new belief that eating meat is morally wrong. It seems difficult to see how like what Mary says should change how she feels about the situation. There's like nothing there. And the way that's the kind of cases that philosophers have been working with, and that they assume that's just the type of moral testimony that is typical in everyday life. So I think Eric Weiland tells us as much in the quote. He says moral testimony in the wild tends to be about which of several relevant features win out and should ultimately guide one's actions, overriding or otherwise defeating the other relevant features. So in other ways, like moral testimony tells you whether an action is right or wrong typically, and it tells you in virtue of which, like in virtue, which feature is it that makes it right or wrong. That's the kind of work that moral testimony is doing, according to Weiland. And of course, if that's your picture of moral testimony, then yeah, that's not going to like change anything about how you feel about a situation. But is this the right characterization of moral testimony in the wild? And here I am not so sure. It seems to me that often we look for moral guidance, not because we're trying to figure out which of several considerations is the more weighty one or how to combine them, but it's because the moral situation is confusing, and that confusion is distressing. And what we need help with is with making sense of the situation. So here I think Calhoun gets it really right. She's got this lovely quote that I have on the handout. She says, "A friend who asks, 'What should I do?' asks neither for a pronouncement nor a list of rules. She asks for help in putting her situation into perspective, finding some interpretation of her circumstances that will make one course of action clearly preferable." Okay, so I suggest that we think of the advice that Calhoun is describing, the one that aims at providing an interpretive key to a situation, hermeneutical advice. And so what I want to do for the rest of the talk is kind of to get clear on what that advice is and what it does. And so let me give you an example that we can refer to. So here's one. Imagine Sarah, who has a very high-powered job in consulting. But after she and her partner John had children, they decided that she would take a few years off to look after them. Where they live, the cost of childcare is very high, and John, who is a few years older, had already been promoted and was making more money. Sarah enjoys having time for the kids, but after a while, she finds that her mood is slipping. John works very long hours, so she is looking after 2 toddlers by herself. She's doing all the household logistics, because John is often traveling. She often feels exhausted and irritable, particularly at John. But then she's also feeling guilty for feeling resentful. After all, like, he is working very hard. And one day, feeling particularly discontent, she decides to talk things through with a friend. And she basically tells her friend, like, "Look, I'm so tired in the evenings, I'm barely standing upright." And then John comes home and he wants to give me he wants me to give him my attention and listen to him, tell me about whatever went down at his work. And I really just want to be left in peace. And then he complains that I don't take an interest in him. And then I feel guilty because he does really have a stressful job. Like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm just constantly annoyed. Everyone annoys me. And her friend then kind of notes Riley, well, it sounds like maybe you need a break. I mean, John isn't the only one working here. You work all day too. And then on top of all the household and childcare labor, John asks for some more emotional labor on your part. Well, no wonder you're annoyed. Okay, so I think that Sarah here is offering, Sarah's friend here is offering Sarah a kind of moral advice. I think it's reasonable to imagine Sarah reacting to this conversation in the following way, where she thinks like, oh, right, I am actually working very hard. Like, that is why I'm annoyed. Like, I'm not being unreasonable or crazy or ungrateful. Like, I just need a break. Like, this is just not a sustainable arrangement. But at the same time, like, what exactly is it that Sarah's friend is offering to her? I don't think she's simply offering her like a moral pronouncement that this situation is unjust or that this situation is one of labor. Like, rather, it seems that what Sarah's friend is offering Sarah is like a way of framing her situation, like a way of thinking about it. So she's offering something like a holistic outlook that comprises like multiple parts that work together. And this outlook consists of, for one, kind of salience features. So insofar as Sarah accepts her friend's advice and starts thinking of her situation as one in which she's doing all the household work, she is going to have suddenly, like, this is going to be trigger dispositions in Sarah to find certain features about her situation salient. So she's going to find something salient experientially, in the sense that just kind of they stand out in her visual field. That's kind of what she notices, as well as cognitive salience in terms of kind of which beliefs she finds kind of come surface in her mind easily. The outlook seems to comprise something like concern. So it's going to foreground dispositions to certain values, certain desires, certain commitments. So in Sarah's case, like, there's going to be like the concern for fairness and for having one's contribution acknowledged. These are the kinds of concerns that are going to kind of rise to the surface. There's going to be, the outlook is going to comprise like certain concepts. So Sarah is going to find it easier, like she's going to be disposed to think of her situation using certain concepts which she may have had earlier, but she wasn't disposed to use. So the concepts of work, the concepts of labor, the concepts of domestic duties, and kind of related the concept of, acknowledgement of compensation in some sense, of kind of considerations of justice and fairness. There's going to be certain kind of associative thoughts. So the dispositions to, draw certain inference, to kind of imagine certain things, to see similarities and differences, to kind of think in terms of certain metaphors or stereotypes or analogies, to draw intuitive connections. So for example, insofar as Sarah takes her friend's advice, she's going to like see similarities between her day and John's day that may have not been salient to her kind of previously, right? And she's going to, like, certain differences are going to stand out to her as well, like the difference that John's work has an endpoint. He's got an end of the day. He's got vacations, but her workload does not include that kind of compensation. Then insofar as it's moral advice, this kind of outlook is a moral one, it's going to involve significance dispositions. So it's going to involve dispositions to attribute significance to a certain salient feature and moral significance in particular. And then finally, the outlook is going to comprise dispositions to respond effectively to certain features and to experience certain feelings as fitting, right? So in Sarah's case, the outlook might include the kind of dispositions to resent an unfair arrangement of workload, and resentment to not having one's contribution acknowledged properly. So then what it is for Sarah to accept her advice is not simply a matter of her kind of coming to believe a certain truth, but rather for her to kind of undergo this change, this transformation, where all of a sudden there's this interrelated set of dispositions, cognitive dispositions, emotional dispositions, kind of desire-based dispositions to kind of come together in this unified whole and to kind of shape her experience of the situation. And we can call this bundle of dispositions a perspective. And here really I'm kind of drawing very much on Elizabeth Camp's work on perspectives and metaphors. She hasn't written much on that in the moral context, but she's written on that kind of more generally. And the way Camp characterizes a perspective is pretty much as a open-ended disposition to characterize, to encounter, to interpret, and to respond to some parts of the world in certain ways. Okay, so we've seen that so I've suggested that Sarah's friend has communicated to Sarah not just a truth, but a perspective, and that insofar as Sarah takes up her friend's advice, she does not merely come to believe some truth, but she comes to take up a perspective on her situation. So of course that presupposes that perspectives can be communicated, so that these kind of complex bundles of dispositions can be triggered by communicative acts. How does that happen? Like, is that plausible at all? I think it is plausible, and it does happen. It happens all the time. And one kind of central mechanism for communicating these outlooks is via metaphors. So suppose I tell you that white supremacy is a cancer. I've drawn a comparison here between cancer and white supremacy, and like, look, this is kind of triggering this kind of complex set of dispositions now on your part. Like, all of a sudden, certain features about supremacy are going to stand out to you that may not have been salient before. The fact that it spreads, that it's lethal, that it's dangerous, that it requires vigilance. That you're like disposed to use certain concepts in order to characterize supremacy. You might start saying about how white supremacy metastasizes in different communities. It presents white supremacy as something to be feared and to be vigilant of, just as cancer. So it kind of it has this, it evokes this really rich set of associations, this kind of mental setting to thinking about white supremacy, which kind of involves all of these components, which I have set out kind of on the handout. So I think that's kind of one way of communicating perspectives generally. I think in moral language, interestingly, this happens very often through thick concepts. So, if you call someone a liar, for example, it's not just that you're communicating that this person has lied on some occasion. Rather, you're kind of communicating a whole way of thinking about that person as someone who, you make the fact that they tell untruths very salient. You kind of make salient all the times in which they have told untruths. You present them as you present this feature not just as an accidental feature, but as an essential and important and explanatory feature of their character, which explains kind of why it is that they act in certain ways. Kind of triggers a set of, like, it evokes a set of concepts. So that's and you know, and of course it engages our affective responses, like a liar is someone to be disdained. Okay, so I have suggested that there are certain situations in which agents are confused and dissatisfied about their situation. And in those cases, it's not because they lack some truth about the situation, but because they kind of don't have a way of making sense of it. They kind of lack a coherent outlook on the situation, which allows them to kind of put together features that they find salient in a satisfying, holistic way. And I've suggested that sometimes the job of testimony or the job of advice is precisely to provide that, that perspective. So I now want to give you a second example where I want to suggest that this very, very clearly can involve an affective component. I mean, I think it's clear that it involves an affective component, even in Sarah's case, right? Like in Sarah's case, once she starts thinking about what she's doing as work, like her feelings of resentment and dissatisfaction make sense. Like that perspective validates those feelings. It makes sense to feel resentful when your work is not being acknowledged. It makes sense to feel resentful if you're like, if your work goes uncompensated. It makes sense to feel resentful and annoyed if the distribution is unfair. So even in that case, you know, it might not, I mean, it doesn't change so much Sarah's feelings about the situation, but it kind of changes her feelings about her feelings. She can come to regard them as reasonable. So I want to give you now a second example where I think there's kind of a more dramatic shift. And that's the case of Chiara, who is working closely with a colleague who is a senior academic at her institution on a project. And, you know, they've been friendly, if not close before, and their collaboration has been productive, but it has not been altogether smooth. There are a number of details, small but important, on which Chiara and this senior academic disagree. The senior academic tries a number of times, somewhat heatedly, to bring Chiara around to his point of view, but Chiara is not moved. And this is partly because she simply weighs some of those considerations differently. And also partly because she thinks her colleague is misjudging aspects of the situation. Okay, when it comes to present the results, her colleague takes the lead, and Chiara is surprised that he simply presents his take on the issue as the settled consensus view. And when Chiara cautiously pushes back during the subsequent discussion, the colleague grows visibly angry and publicly accuses her of not knowing what she wants. And then he starts yelling. He says, like, look, I'm trying to keep this show on the road. There's an awkward silence in the room. Then the discussion continues as if nothing had happened. And Chiara is kind of stunned and upset. She feels embarrassed and somewhat confused. She kind of keeps replaying the exchange in her mind, trying to figure out what she could have done differently to avoid the escalation. You know, was it her saying? Was it her tone? And then afterwards, she talks things through with her friend. And her friend says, look, I'll tell you what just happened. What your colleague did is he threw a tantrum. Like, that's what he did. I mean, how mortifying for him. Like, no wonder things got really awkward. You know, at least he didn't throw himself on the floor crying. Okay, so in that case, I think, again, Chiara's friend is offering Chiara like a way of making sense of the situation, a way of looking at the events she just experienced that foregrounds make salient different aspects than the ones to which Chiara was attending, and which attributes different significance to those aspects than what Chiara was attributing to them. And crucially, I think here, her friend is not just offering a different way of thinking about the situation, but also a different way of feeling about it. It's not Chiara who needs to feel embarrassed about what happened, but her colleague. In fact, I think we might even say that Chiara's friend encourages Chiara to take the something like the objective stance towards the colleague. So think about Peter Strawson's characterization of what the objective stance is. Strawson tells us that to adopt the objective attitude to another human being is to see him perhaps as an object of social policy, as a subject for what in a wide range of sense might be called treatment, as something certainly to be taken account, perhaps precautionary account of, to be managed or handled or cured or trained, or perhaps simply to be avoided. The objective attitude may be emotionally toned in many ways, but not in all ways. It may include repulsion or fear. It may include pity or even love, but not all kinds of love. But crucially, it cannot involve the range of reactive feelings and attitudes, which belong to involvement or participation with others in interpersonal human relationships. If your attitude towards someone is wholly objective, then though you might fight him, you cannot quarrel with him, and though you may talk to him, even negotiate with him, you cannot reason with him. You can at most pretend to quarrel or reason to him. So, I mean, I think it's a bit tricky. It's not like Chiara's friend encourages Chiara to take the wholesale objective attitude towards her colleague, but she is encouraging her to take up the objective attitude to some degree, in the sense that by suggesting that she think of his behavior as a tantrum, she kind of suggests of thinking of him like of a spoiled toddler who throws himself on the floor, or throws herself on the floor when she does not get her way. And so she kind of consequently also suggests that Chiara should feel differently about what happened. Like, she shouldn't feel, just as with a toddler, like you don't feel offended when they throw themselves on the floor because you've given them milk in the red cup, and it's actually in our case it's the blue cup instead of you don't emotionally engage. And then in some sense that's what Chiara's friend is recommending. She's like, you just do not emotionally engage, you just view this as a tantrum that happened. And I think so in that sense we think of so kind of by thinking of what happened as a tantrum, we are adopting something like at least a partially objective attitude at the situation. So I think this is this is something that I need to think about more. So this is still slightly tentative, but I think there is a really interesting connection here between Strawson's distinction between the objective and the participant stand, and this idea of perspectives as these bundles of dispositions which make salient certain features of the situation. And I think this is clear from the text that we looked at by Strawson, where basically, he tells us that to take up the participant stance is to be disposed to think of the action in a particular way. It is to be disposed to find intentions salient, to kind of attend to a range of moral values and evaluations, to employ particular concepts, to taxonomize actions as intentional or unintentional, and to foreground our interest in being treated with respect and having others show us goodwill. So it engages our effective responses, disposing us to respond with gratitude and resentment. So we kind of take up the participant attitude by taking certain perspectives on a situation. So Chiara was taking the participant attitude on her situation by kind of thinking that maybe she had offended somehow, or that her colleague had a point, that he was objecting to something that she did. And her friend recommends that rather she should take up something like an objective perspective, an objective stance, which we also take up by taking a particular perspective on the situation. A perspective that constitutes an objective stance is one that makes salient different features of the situation than perspectives that constitute the participant stand. What is the kind of salient about the perspectives what do perspectives which constitute the objective stance make salient? Well, they kind of foreground our concern with managing the situation, with avoiding certain outcomes. It involves, these kind of perspectives employ concepts that foregrounds consequences and outcomes as opposed to intentions of the agent. They foreground causes of behavior and actions as opposed to kind of reasons for behavior and actions. And they marshal different sets of feelings. So I think once we start thinking about the participant stance and the objective stance as stances which we take up by taking certain perspectives on a situation, certain puzzling things about Strawson also become a little bit clearer. I mean, one thing that always puzzled me is how Strawson says that they're not really, those two stances are not contradictory, but they're rather opposing. And I kind of think, okay, now this makes sense to me. If you think about perspectives and you think an important feature of perspectives is what they make salient about a situation, then yes, the objective and the participant stance are opposing, because the perspectives which constitute them, they make salient, like the reactive perspectives make salient what the objective perspectives like render to the, like put in the background, and vice versa, right? The reactive attitudes foreground intentionality, like with the agent's intentions. And that's exactly what the objective stance puts in the background. So that's the sense in which they're opposing. Okay, but the important thing is here that this advice, so by giving someone advice to take up a certain perspective, we can make it the case that they take either an objective or the reactive stance on an action or on a situation which they didn't do before. But this, to take the reactive stance or to take the objective stance, involves having certain feelings, certain affective responses to the situation. And so it simply follows that that kind of advice can transmit feelings and kind of affective responses to the situation. Okay, so this kind of gets us closer to the conclusion that I want, which is that hermeneutical advice, the kind of advice that Chiara and Sarah receive, is not just informative, but it can be genuinely emotionally transformative. It can be emotionally transformative in Sarah's case, because she may, in coming to think of her activity as work, her kind of amorphous sense of frustration and resentment can kind of crystallize into the feeling of being treated unfairly, feeling insufficiently appreciated, feeling overworked. Similarly, kind of coming to think of her colleague's outburst as a tantrum, Chiara's feelings about the situation may change. I mean, for one, she may stop feeling embarrassed about it, and she may start feeling embarrassed of her colleague, or she may stop feeling wounded by his treatment, which she did as long as she was, thinking of him as reprimanding her, as opposed to thinking of what he was doing as having a tantrum. So instead of feeling wounded by his treatment of her, she may arrive at a sense of emotional detachment that goes along with taking the objective stance towards someone in that situation. Okay, so this kind of hermeneutical advice can be then emotionally transformative. So then the question that remains is whether it is proper. So, as you've noticed, I've been kind of using testimony and advice interchangeably, but you might think that that's being just slippery, and that really here there's a serious objection lurking to what I've been arguing, because you might think, well, I've kind of I'm slightly equivocating between two different kinds of advice. Look, there's the kind of moral testimony that the literature is concerned about, and that's that kind of testimony involves deference. So it involves accepting a moral proposition on someone's say-so. But and they might think, look, really, people were worried about these kinds of cases. These are the cases where the problem of emotional detachment is supposed to come about. But you might think, look, it doesn't like the examples that I'm then adducing, those don't really help, because in those examples, there isn't any deference involved. I've just described a completely different kind of thing that's going on. So in a hermeneutical advice, maybe there isn't anything like deference. Hermeneutical advice works more like midwifery, where it helps you to see things for yourself as opposed to telling you that things are thus and so. And that's why this kind of emotional transformation can happen. So you're not really relying on testimony in those cases. So also I haven't solved any problem for moral testimony, because these just aren't cases of testimony. And that's kind of the idea. So Austin Hills has suggested something along those lines. So she has suggested that we need to distinguish between two different ways in which testimony can work. On the one hand, their testimony can simply transmit knowledge. So the speaker's knowledge that P expressed through her testimony, in that case, is an epistemic ground for the learner's knowledge that P, and that's what happens in those cases of deference. But Hills also thinks that testimony can sometimes propagate moral knowledge. But in those cases, it's not really testimony, and that's because it's not like the agent isn't really relying on the speaker's justification for the justification of her own belief. Rather, the speaker just kind of causally triggers acquisition of knowledge on behalf of the learner. So propagation of knowledge, the speaker's knowledge that P expressed through her testimony is a causal factor and an epistemic influence on the learner's gaining knowledge that P, but it's not an epistemic ground for it. So another way in which, another way of kind of spelling this out that Hills also gives is, she says, look, when you really rely, when you defer, the testimony gives you epistemic reasons for your belief. And that's what gives rise to the problem of deference. And then she thinks, but sometimes testimony might not give you epistemic reasons. It can give you practical reasons to engage in certain forms of inquiry. And in that case, you're not deferring, and there isn't really any problem in moral testimony. And you might think that hermeneutical testimony, hermeneutical advice, as I have described it, that's more a case of propagation as opposed to transmission. So it's a case in which we encourage the hearer to find like other reasons for a belief. We send them on a course of inquiry as opposed to kind of telling them what to believe. Okay, so I mean, I think there's something right here, but I'm not fully convinced. And I think the trouble is that thinking of hermeneutical advice as simply propagating knowledge doesn't quite get the kind of epistemic normative profile of hermeneutical advice right. And that's because when Sarah's friend suggests to Sarah that she should think of her situation as one involving work, it's not like she gives her practical reason to embark on a certain inquiry, on the inquiry of, am I working? Similarly, like when Chiara's friend tells Chiara that her colleague was simply having a tantrum, it's not like she gives Chiara practical reasons for thinking about whether her colleague had a tantrum. But at the same time, I think Hills is right that whatever it is that hermeneutical advice transmits is like different from what kind of the box standard cases of moral testimony are, where you're simply told that eating meat is wrong. So one suggestion here is that maybe cases of hermeneutical advice transmit something like know-how. So perspectives are ways of making sense of a situation. Knowing a way of making sense of a situation is knowing how to make sense of it. And thus, when you take hermeneutical advice, what you accept is you acquire a piece of know-how which you lacked previously. And I think if that's how we think of it, then the speaker, like Chiara's friend or Sarah's friend, they are giving Sarah and Chiara genuine epistemic grounds for kind of accepting the perspective. It's not simply just practical reasons. There's epistemic authority. And when Sarah takes up the perspective offered by her friend, that is an act of trust on the part of Sarah. Similarly, when Chiara kind of takes up the perspective of a tantrum, when she accepts her friend's hermeneutical advice, that is an act of trust by way of Chiara. And where there's trust, there's also vulnerability, so perspectives, of course, are not always apt. They can be misleading, they can be gaslighting, they can be morally problematic. And so both Sarah and Chiara, insofar as they adopt the perspective, they are taking it on trust, and they are treating their friends as moral authorities in those situations. I mean, not full-blown moral authorities on all questions, but a moral authority on that particular question that they come to them. So I think there is more going on here. There's there's genuine epistemic transmission going on here, and not simply the kind of propagation that Hills has in mind. Okay, I think that gets me through the main things. I can point to some loose threads which I haven't fully worked out yet. I mean, I think the propagation transmission bit is not fully worked out yet either. But just another kind of loose thread that I want to throw out before we move to the Q&A is that I think that once you start thinking that hermeneutical advice is a really important part of our practice of giving each other moral testimony, you start thinking differently about what it takes to be a moral advisor and a good moral advisor. And I'm really interested in kind of thinking through that more, because it's no longer the case that that a good moral authority, like a moral expert, simply is someone who knows the right answer to a moral question. To figure out what the right perspective is on the situation, that is really complicated business. It requires you to kind of know the person, to know the situation, maybe to empathize with a person in a particular way. So it kind of marshals a set of skills and a kind of situational knowledge that kind of go beyond what philosophers typically think in terms of moral expertise. So I think that's a question that I'm curious. I want to think about more, and if people have questions about it, I'm happy to discuss. But other than that, I think I will end here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Paulina. It was very, very interesting. I loved it. Now I'm gonna open the. Oh, we have questions already. So let me close the chat first. So Mario, you can go first. I put myself in the list as well. Mario, do you have a question? You have
Yeah. No,
okay.
I wonder if Sophia and Michela were before me. But
oh, okay. Sorry, I just had a look at the list. If Sophia go first, then, and then Michele, and then Mario.
Thank you. I loved your talk. I just have to apologize because I have to leave at 6, but I wanted to take this opportunity to ask you something. And I'm very interested in cases, in borderline cases, where this bundle of beliefs and desire-based dispositions are not fully conveyed. And I wonder what you think about situation where, for example, in the Sarah situation, the one who has children, imagine that her friend gives some advice and she understands the situation more properly, but she forms wrong disposition, not the kind of disposition that the friend wanted to produce, to instill. So in this case of situation, what would you think? Is that a fail case of moral testimony, although the beliefs part was correct? Or you can imagine also the reverse, a situation where the emotions are the right ones, but not the beliefs. So what would you think about these cases?
Yeah, tricky. I think one would have to think kind of exactly about what is being. I would want to kind of spell out the details of the situation. But I think, I mean, I'm happy to think that there will be failed cases of hermeneutical advice, where, so for example, suppose that so one easy way of thinking about it is where kind of there is one word, like there is, you have very, very different associations and feelings and what it makes salient to you when you think of cancer than someone else does. And so then when someone kind of describes this in this term, all of a sudden you've kind of, you've put them into a whole different state of mind from maybe what you've intended. And the very same thing can happen in the moral cases as well, right? Where you intended to communicate something by framing the situation in a particular way, but the agent just goes off in a completely different direction. Yeah, so I think these are just cases of failed communication, where the advisor just didn't manage to get across the perspective that they were trying to get across.
Before I leave the floor to Michele, can you, Paulina, stop sharing the screen?
So, oh yeah, I can.
Yeah. Go ahead, Michele.
Okay. Thank you, Paulina. Thank you very much for this stimulating introduction, because I had a lot of ideas that were new, although related to context in which I already had, of course, some acquaintance. Now, just going through your handout, I had a couple of puzzles. The first concerns the idea of a perspective, in which all of the previous concepts, such as concern, associative thought, and significance, and so on, come in. It seems that the metaphor that follows, white supremacy is a cancer, seems to clarify, at least for me, that a perspective should have something like something morally normative as a presupposition. That is to say, can we have a perspective setting completely aside the idea of moral normativity? This is the first puzzle. The second puzzle comes later in your handout with the objective stance. Is the objective stance something that we can really use in a personal exchange? When we talk about objective stance, this reminds me of what in the literature in moral philosophy was often called the detached standpoint by philosophers such as Thomas Nagel, and going quite back to Kant, but the idea is very similar. So can we introduce this objective stance as something to be compared to the other one, the participative stance, which sounds much closer to what we have in our usual personal exchanges? And finally, something that you said at the very end concerning moral advisor, that again comes back to what I was saying at the beginning. It seems probably I am not perfectly self-assured on this, but what you said about the moral advisor seems to give priority to his cognitive capacities on any other, again, on normative, or being morally normative. So most of what you are saying in this presentation is of a cognitive, on the cognitive side, setting aside the morally normative. I hope I didn't misunderstand you entirely. Thank you.
Great, thank you. On the let me address the objective stance in the connection to Nagel.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually think Strawson, so it's right, it's confusing because Nagel also talks about the objective stance and the kind of point, the view from nowhere.
Yes.
That's actually, I don't think that's that's not quite the way in which Strawson kind of introduces the term, and the way in which I think of it in the moral, or like in the moral responsibility debate. There, the idea really is the objective stance towards a person is not so much objective in the sense of being detached, but it's rather in kind of how you relate with the person, whether you think of them as being the kind of person who could be a friend or a partner, or whether you think of that person as first and foremost someone who is a problem to be managed, something to be handled, a danger to be avoided. So it really is about kind of which aspects of the person you're foregrounding and which kind of responses, because of that, you take to be appropriate towards that person. So the kind of objective, it's objective not because it's necessarily detached, but because what it highlights about this, it's a slightly unfortunate, I think, terminological choice actually, but because what it highlights, it's the kind of causal, the causes for someone's actions or behavior as opposed to their reasons, and that it kind of makes impossible having certain emotional responses to that person. That's the kind of idea. I agree. I haven't thought of this before, but I think I agree that kind of objective as calling this objective is kind of misleading, because it's not really objective in that sense at all.
So an object, like in a way, we might say in personal in exchanges, taking distances from someone, because we don't want to get involved. We want to look at him from a certain distance.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, so Strawson says explicitly, like, sometimes this objective stance is just forced upon us. When you're dealing with someone who's schizophrenic and who's like completely psychotic, like you have to take the objective stance towards them. Like that's just forced upon you by the situation. That person just is not the kind, she's not in the kind of situation in which she can manifest goodwill and kind of make rational and reasonable choices. But Strawson also thinks that sometimes we can choose to take up the objective stance because the strains of involvements would be too much. So I can choose to see my mother-in-law as a problem to be managed, as opposed to being a mean-spirited woman. My mother-in-law is lovely, so this is purely fictional, but but that's the kind of idea.
That's fine, thank you.
Mario, it's your turn.
Okay, so still on this, on the participant versus the objective perspective. I think that if I understand Strawson as some of them, is also what he wrote later, and some, for example, in naturalism and skepticism and naturalism. So it seems to me that it's not just that he wants us to detach from some people thinking, okay, let's consider them like, not like friends or people we know, but difficult people. I think he really thinks that we sometimes consider someone only from a causal point of view. That's the idea. So it's very radical. It's not like Nagel, but still, we consider someone as someone who's doesn't have, we don't consider their responsibility, their free will, nothing like that, their intentions, only causal, the causal point of view. In the other way, instead, we introduce all the other notions. Someone who works in this direction, for example, is Achille Pilgrami in Self-Knowledge and Resentment. That's exactly so there are two ways we look at human beings. This is really the Kantian idea, but it's secularized, right? There are no women or phenomena. It's the same world, but we can look at human beings as just the products of causes, or as intentional entities with mental states and so on. I think this is stronger than just saying, okay, it's there, let's assume it. So you really look at these two different ways, but there is a big problem here, metaethical, more generally, in philosophy of mind. What is the relationship really you can look at human beings from two different perspectives, the causal and the reasonable. or what attributions or reasons. What is the relationship with these two perspectives? Belgrami thinks that they are incommensurable, really. There is no way you two different categorically distinct ways of looking. Some other people think of, one emerges from the other, or as McDowell and Putnam, there is kind of a supervenience between the two perspectives. So descriptions in one sense supervenes on the other. So if two people are described in the same moral, with the same moral attitudes, if they are in the same physical attitude, they should have the same moral perspective. We should have the same moral perspective. That's the idea, right? Supervenience, global supervenience. So, but it's much more than just saying, I think, I won't think of about the projects of my mother-in-law, but I think she is, still reasonable or unreasonable. No, I simply change it drastically, the perspective. And so you have to explain what is the relationship. And I think that's a very interesting issue between these two perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't see in Strawson quite that radical split, like quite such a radical split between the two perspectives, saying like that intentional states or mental states don't matter at all. I mean, I can think of, desires and beliefs are causes of action. So I can take the objective stance towards someone.
There are two ways of looking at causes intentional states, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with the final cause, as a final causes, as McDowell does, final causes, right? And that's one way. The other one is just a product of another chain of things. For this reason, he uses the prototypical example of the objective view is the schizophrenic or someone with a pathological state, because we cannot attribute intentional states to them. We don't consider them intentional states when we assume the objective perspectives. We can consider them like states that are produced by something, but there are no really final causes, nothing that can grant responsibility, because this is the point of that paper. You cannot you cannot grant responsibility if you assume the objective perspective.
That's right. So the objective stance goes along with responsibility. But I think we disagree on some kind of exegetical points about how the objective stance should be characterized, right? Because it's kind of hard to reconcile this kind of really severe split with the bits in Strawson where he thinks, oh, but we can sometimes take up the objective stance for a bit.
Yeah.
As a respite from
use which perspective. That's exactly what he does. But they are different. It's not that they are communicating. They are different perspectives.
Well, they're different, but I guess the question is what the difference consists in, right? So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess my suggestion was that the difference consists in what they make, kind of what they make salient, what they bring to the foreground when you think about that person. Mm-hmm. I mean, are you thinking that that's just not the right way?
It's the right way, but so these are two different perspectives. So in one sense, we don't attribute responsibility. In the other, we do. So in order to attribute responsibility, you have to attribute to the person a panoply of mental states that you don't attribute in the other sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm not convinced that we don't attribute mental states in the other case.
In this sense, in the sense that are mental states that grant attribution of responsibility.
Yeah.
So, that sense.
Okay, maybe we agree then. Maybe.
Glad to see that you've come to an agreement. Maria Silvia, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for a great talk. I have a question concerning your final remarks on the, let's say, specificity of hermeneutical advice with respect to other forms of testimony. I was wondering whether, one might say that hermeneutical testimony requires wisdom rather than other kinds of expertise. So, because I tend to think of being wise as a form of being moral experts in a way, but in a practical sense. So I was wondering whether this kind of testimony, which involves affective changes and a different emotional involvement, might require that the moral advisor in this sense is a wise person. So with a character which enables her to see the specificity of the situation, to perceive the salience, and to be emotionally involved in the situation. And my other question would be, independently of the answer to the first question, whether you think there's specific entitlement conditions to be to hermeneutical advisors, like, say, since it implies a shift in attitudes and emotions, maybe you're entitled to be such kind of an advisor only if, for example, there's an emotional bond between the two people, or other kinds of entitling conditions.
Yeah, great. So on the first one, I think that's right. So I've been kind of this is something very much that I've been thinking about, and I've come to think about it from the kind of work that I've done on moral understanding, right? Where I say moral understanding, like to have moral understanding in the sense of kind of moral understanding about a situation or a subject matter, is to have an ability to know stuff about that situation, so to respond to evidence. So I've been kind of thinking that what I've been thinking about quite seriously is like, okay, well, that's great, but what is it that actually gives you this ability? And what I've been thinking is that basically perspectives constitute that ability. Kind of perspectives mediate between having a particular perspective, mediates between being in a situation and kind of being able to access certain knowledge about it, right? Because by taking up a perspective on a situation, you become sensitive to particular features about the situation. These stand out to you. They also stand out to you as being morally significant, as opposed to kind of loads of other things that are also going on in that case, right? And so having a perspective is what really allows you to come to have particular kind of knowledge in a situation. So moral perspectives are kind of building blocks of moral understanding. And then I was thinking, well, look, what is it that characterizes the wise person? What characterizes the wise person is precisely like a wealth of perspectives that they can draw on and that they can bring to bear on the situation. So that's the kind of wisdom, is to having this toolbox of different perspectives that you can, to some extent, choose between or kind of shift in between. Because any situation is going, so, the tricky thing is that I think very often situations outstrip just being able taken in a whole. So you're going to have to be able, but perspectives are selective. They foreground some things at the cost of backgrounding others. So wisdom will kind of involve in being able to shift between those different perspectives in order to be able kind of to make sense of the whole. So I think that's a necessary condition for being a good advisor. I'm not quite sure if it's sufficient, because I think that there is something kind of that, yes, I think this is where we're getting to your second question, right? Is that in order to be a good advisor, you're never going to be able to be a good advisor to everyone. You can be a good advisor to someone, and that's because even if you have the kind of wealth of perspectives at your disposal, you have to, in order to be able to good advice, you have to figure out which perspective does this person here, which is confused, need. And that is going to depend very much, not just on the situation, but also on the kind of concerns and particular epistemic issues of the person looking for the advice. And so and like being a good advisor, like sometimes it's a bit like when you teach someone, sometimes a student might they're not, so like when you learn how to sing, for example, like you might start out with having certain bad habits, and it's impossible to get you to drop those habits without kind of giving you a crutch. So the singing teacher will tell you to do something else. And then eventually, once you've gotten rid of the old habit, they're going to tell you to get rid of the new thing that you've now gotten into the habit to as well, right? But that step was kind of necessary in order to get you to where you want to be. And I think something similar might be often true with the perspectives. Like sometimes you might not be, like Sarah might not be ready for the work perspective. She might need a kind of intermediate one, which isn't going to give her quite as much knowledge about her situation, but it's not going to be quite as flawed as the one that she started out with. And then maybe she's going to be ready for the next step. So a good advisor is going to be kind of attuned to those kinds of limitations of the person looking for advice as well.
May I just, sorry, super quickly add a follow-up? Thanks. No, yeah, and another worry would be, since it seems that shifting perspectives is kind of a deep and very personal and profound endeavor, maybe you're also not supposed to operate such shift in someone unless you have some kind of special connection. It's not just that you can't because you don't know which perspective fits or suits that person, but that it would be like patronizing or moralistic unless you had some kind of moral permission or entitlement in the sense of being allowed to.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, I haven't thought of, I mean, I think for some cases that might definitely be true. I'm not sure it's always true. I mean, I kind of think, I don't think, I guess because I think there's a lot of perspective shifts which do not kind of, aren't like wholly transformative. They're just, they just kind of bring up different things that, different, like they just kind of reconfigure which dispositions are current about you in the situation. But you're right that like certain things might only be up for, only a therapist maybe has the right standing to bring about certain shifts because they have the right kind of relationship to you. I mean, I think that's plausible for some perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Matilde?
Thank you very much for your talk. That was super interesting. And my question is actually very basic. So apologies for the naivety of it, but I'm not very familiar with all this literature. But it comes down to what is the difference between knowledge and understanding, because to the question that you asked, what actually happens, who is the good moral advisor? Well, from what you said, what I think is someone who can tell you what actually happened to you in that situation, but both externally and internally. As you said, this man was being a toddler, but also you are entitled to all your emotions because of what you're going through. So it feels like he's someone who's kind of knows, both understands, but also kind of knows what actually happened. Could we say that? Because then going back to the problem of what testimony actually is. I agree that propagation maybe doesn't sound that accurate, but why can't it be a sort of transmission of understanding? Then why can that be a form of knowledge as well? But maybe I'm saying something horrible. I don't know. But that's my question. That's something I really cannot pinpoint of your talk. But thank you very much for everything was very clear.
Yeah, no, that's that is not a naive question at all. I mean, I guess because there's a sense in which what you're looking for is not simply knowing what, I mean, there's a sense in which both Sarah and Chiara know what happened to them, right? There was a meeting, her colleague said something, she said something, her colleague started yelling, it was awkward. Like that is what happened to her. And then there's different ways of thinking about what happened to her. And I also think these things are not, it's not that there's one, that it's not like merely a question of accuracy, because I actually think multiple can be true, right? Like her colleague threw a tantrum, her colleague was a jerk, her colleague mistreated her. So there's kind of different ways of thinking about them. And it's not that one of them is true and the other one is false. I mean, they differ slightly in what they foreground and background about the situation, what they kind of emphasize about it. And so that's why kind of it's not merely a question of what happened. It's the question of kind of how to think about it. And part of that is, and here it's where like the best way to think about what happened for Sarah is of course going to be responsive to what actually, to the events that actually went down. Like obviously that's going to be a constraint. But it's also going to be responsive to what's going to be useful. I mean, you know, what's going to be useful for Sarah to kind of how to think about that situation. So that's the sense in which she isn't simply looking, there's more kind of then, she's not looking for like what happened. She's looking for a particular way of structuring the information, what happened. And that's not merely responsible to what actually went down, but also to kind of Sarah's situation.
Chiara?
Yes. Sorry, okay. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very inspiring to me. So when we look for a moral guidance, it's because we lack the way how to make sense of a certain situation. And I wonder, and I ask you, could we say that this lack is a lack of moral imagination, as the capacity to imagine other ways to resolve and interpret a given circumstance? Because I think that people who need more moral guidance, it's because they need more to increase their moral creativity, because creativity is problem solving in a way. So it's very useful also in difficult moral circumstances. So.
Yeah, good. I mean, I tend to think that sometimes we are stuck not because we lack moral imagination, but because the situation, I mean, because maybe the situation is difficult and we're really upset about what happened. So, you know, in that sense, I mean, if you want to say maybe in that case, we kind of need help because we're unable to exercise our moral imagination, or we're stuck in a particular way. So I think I don't think that kind of the need for moral guidance always indicates a lack of moral imagination. But I do think that moral imagination might be really important in kind of constructing new moral perspectives. So like when you're in a, you know, when just kind of completely new moral situations arise, and sometimes like, I mean, so this kind of draws the connection to the kind of cases of hermeneutical injustice, which Miranda Fricker discusses, where so she discusses these cases of consciousness raising. She has this example of Carmita Woods, this woman who was sexually harassed before the concept of sexual harassment was really coined. And she goes through this consciousness raising event with a bunch of other women, and they start describing what happened to them, and they notice the kind of similarities, and then they settle on the term sexual harassment to describe what happened to them. So I mean, I think these kinds of exercises are exercises of moral imagination, and they're exercises of joint exercises of moral imagination. I mean, I think that one of the limitations of Fricker's view is that she thinks of these cases as ways of constructing a new concept. Whereas I actually think what goes on here is that what happens in those consciousness raising meetings is that people are constructing kind of new perspectives, new ways of thinking about the situation, new associations, new metaphors. So it's richer. But these kinds of things, these do involve like really genuine creativity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Julia?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm not very familiar with the literature, but when you introduced the problem, when you said that moral testimony is the problem is that moral testimony cannot change your feelings and makes you emotionally alienated. I had the impression that maybe the literature on moral testimony in this issue is kind of influenced by the kind of old school idea of emotions as brute and insensitive to rational considerations, so that when someone tells you something, it is not that your emotions change accordingly. So there's, I mean, it's of course a view of emotion which scholars reject, but which still influences many debates. And so, yeah, I was wondering whether you also think that to account for your hermeneutical advice, you will tackle the issue of how emotion responds to reason and to other considerations, and to use this like reevaluation of emotions. Thank you.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think there is a bit of that. I mean, I think you don't have to, I mean, so I think there is a bit of a maybe naive view of emotions that underpins some of those objections. Because it doesn't help that there is no literature on emotions actually cited by some of the authors who are bringing it forward. But I mean, I think you can kind of motivate the worry, even if you think that emotions are genuinely responsive to rational considerations and to reasons, because all it needs for the worry to get started is the observation that, you know, simply telling you that an action is right or wrong isn't going to like magically transform how you feel about the action. And that's at the same time, that's the way in which those authors are thinking about moral testimony. They think about it as simply assertions that an action is right or that an action is wrong, or that the reasons for doing something outweigh the reasons for not doing it. You know, so if that's the content of testimony, then it seems really unlikely that your emotions are going to change by you coming to believe that content. So I think I would say that the concerns are less, the issue here is less that there's a kind of naive theory of emotions that constricts those writers, but rather that it's a very impoverished view of what we do and we give each other moral advice. That's kind of that I see at fault.
So I don't see any more hands, so I'm gonna throw my two questions, which I had some time, so I hope to think about them. So I hope I'll be very brief. We don't abuse too much of your patience and generosity. So the first is about the last bit, when you basically anticipated my question / objection about is it deference? And so one way to phrase the question is, well, it seems as though your problem, the starting problem was how affective alienation troubles, let's say, moral deference. And and the way you address the question, and you try to avoid the problem, like, well, but what you're talking about is something different. Maybe I didn't understand well what's going on there, because you point out that there are these two new Hill's definitions of the transmission and propagation, and you say that this distinction doesn't make sense of the hermeneutical advice account you've given, right? But still, my impression is, well, but can't one just say, okay, whatever is what the two definitions that Hills gave recently point to, whatever they are, wasn't the problem about moral deference, strictly moral testimony? Your cases in the end don't seem to be cases of moral testimony. So to keep that short, I wasn't clear how pointing to Hills and replying to Hills in the way you did was meant to get you out of the problem that you raised with the question, is it deference? And the second quick question was simply, how close you're getting to saying that, I mean, your account of perspective and the hermeneutical advice, I mean, I'm curious how close that gets to a view that concedes some sort of transmission of understanding in the moral domain. I think you might want to resist that. Happy if you don't want to resist that, but I was not expecting you to get close to that. And I'm curious whether you're getting close, or you have a good way to say, no, I don't want to get any problem with the transmission of understanding. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, I think I have found my way to thinking that transmission of understanding in the moral domain is fine.
Okay, great.
So I think this is, so I like that. And I think I like that this allows me to do that. So I think I was a little bit cautious about it in the understanding paper, but I think I've worked myself towards a more gung-ho approach to transmission of moral understanding. Yeah, on the first one, yeah, I see the worry. I mean, it wasn't, it's a little bit, I'm finding myself, I mean, I find partly that this is, I find myself partly at a dialectical impasse here, I think. Because, you know, like, basically, if you think the only like moral testimony, to accept moral testimony is to defer, and to defer is just to believe what was asserted. Then, well, you've kind of defined deference in an extremely narrow way, and it might be true that mere deference won't change how you feel about the situation. So testimony which only gives you beliefs isn't going to change how you feel about the situation. Okay, fine. I mean, I do think that even that, as I've said kind of at the beginning of the talk, that kind of overstates the problem of moral alienation, because I think often we defer precisely not because we are alienated, but because we are attuned, right? So I think that argument doesn't kind of get you it doesn't really show that there's something like really problematic about moral testimony. So, you know, so, but in some sense, I just want to question that moral testimony is exhausted, that the phenomenon of moral testimony or moral advice is exhausted by the phenomenon of deference. You know, so the hermeneutical advice is supposed to be an example of testimony or advice where it's not deference as it's defined by accepting a belief that's going on, but where there's nevertheless, like, it's still fine to call it testimony, it's still fine to call it advice, because there is genuine dependence on someone who you take to be an authority on that issue. And it's not just that you take them to point you into an interesting direction that you then pursue, but there is something like deference in the sense that you trust and you make yourself vulnerable to a particular kind of mistake, to making a mistake about the moral situation.
Yeah, perhaps my worry was that in the kind of examples you gave, the kind of testimony that the two advisors give, I mean, I'm very happy with the transmission of understanding view, but I suppose many of the people who would not like that view would say, well, it's clear in those examples that the hearer has some sort of a job to do before getting right whatever was the content of the testimony. The testimony itself is not enough for whatever the hearer to acquire all the ingredients of the perspective account you gave. They would tell you, well, they need to do something more. They need to be already disposed or sensitive to some of these things. And that's what worried me in the first place.
Yeah, I guess I'm not that moved by that worry, because I think that's true in simple testimony as well, right? I mean, like, look, lots of people think of belief as dispositional. So if you come to accept a belief based on testimony, well, what is it? Well, that's to acquire or to trigger a particular disposition. Well, you know, the account I give, it's just more dispositions.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there's not, if you think you can acquire the belief disposition without like working really hard for it, why shouldn't you be able to have those other dispositions, including those salients? I mean, we don't typically work hard for things to become salient to us when someone points them out. So that's why I'm not that worried about that issue.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't see any more ends. So I guess if that's the case, we can set Paulina free and thank her a lot for like the generosity. Like 45 minutes of Q&A, that's quite something. And I don't know if Maria Silva wants to add anything, if she wants to go ahead, otherwise.
Just that our next meeting will be on February 17, same time and place, let's say. And so hope to see you there, many of you there. And thanks again to Paulina, it was great.
Thanks so much for the super interesting discussion. I really enjoyed that.
Okay, bye everyone. It was a pleasure.
Bye everyone.
Bye, have a good weekend.
Bye-bye, you too.